You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 16th of June, 2026 on Monocle Radio.
US President Donald Trump recalls that Ukraine exists, but is a deal really still his to make? Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomes a fellow national leader welcomed in very few other national capitals. And can anything, including the intervention of the Air Force, now deter people from cheating on exams? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Katja Hoyer and Robin Lustig will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from our correspondent in the real Shangri-La. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by Katja Hoyer, journalist, historian and author most recently of Weimar, Life on the Edge of Catastrophe, and by Robin Lustig, journalist, broadcaster, former presenter of The World Tonight on Radio 4 and author of the new book And the Cello Came Too, A Story of Survival. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Katja, first of all, not your first time on Monocle Radio. You were on a while back talking about Weimar, which I can reassure listeners is absolutely excellent. I've read it and everything. But this is your first time on the Daily. So as is traditional, we have made you wear the office owl costume. And as is also traditional, we will ask you to just introduce yourself to our listeners a bit.
Thank you. I am, in fact, not wearing the owl costume. I just want to point that out in case people are imagining this a bit too vividly.
They're supposed to be imagining that.
I'm German. I've got a very literal mind, so I assume everybody else does too. So I'm a historian. I often describe myself as Anglo-German since I was born in Germany, but I've lived in the UK now for the last 15 years and feel very much at home here. But haven't really stopped thinking, writing, talking about Germany, and that's what I pretty much do for a living. I write books about Germany, but also op-eds and commentary and everything else.
Do you even feel at home here when there's a World Cup on?
That's a very good question that I'd rather not answer.
I think you just have. Robin, welcome back to the show. We will be talking in greater depth about your new book for broadcast on a future edition of The Daily, but go right ahead and give it a plug now.
Well, it's absolutely unputdownable, of course. And it sort of picks up where Katja's book leaves off, I think. I mean, my family were originally from Germany. They, both of my parents grew up in the 1920s in pre-Nazi Germany. They were both in their early teenage years when the Nazis came to power. They both fled from Germany in 1939. They ended up serving in the British Army in a very secret military intelligence unit. And so it's a story really of a family which are originally of Jewish heritage, came into some comfort, I suppose, after the emancipation of Jews in the 19th century, were doing pretty well until 1933 when the Nazis came to power, when everything, of course, went very bad very quickly. And it's their story, and I have a huge amount of material to draw on because I'm lucky enough. My father wrote a memoir, his father wrote a memoir, my mother kept a diary during the Second World War. I had all this material to draw on. I'm a journalist, I drew on it.
Well, we will have more on that in a forthcoming edition of The Daily. We start tonight in Evian-les-Bains and the ongoing conclave of the G7, where G6 have spent at least part of the day feigning interest in G1's recounting of his birthday party, where there was a flypast and fireworks and muscular men wrestling in their underwear. Among the bemused audience for these anecdotes was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is possibly more interested in what US President Donald Trump has to say about his country's ongoing fight for survival, which is apparently that a deal can be done, though we have heard this once or twice or several dozen times before. Robin, first of all, is President Trump still actually a meaningful factor here?
It's very difficult to tell, isn't it? Because we simply don't know to what extent anything that he says reflects reality. Does it reflect what he actually thinks? Does it reflect what he will think this time tomorrow? My impression, my guess, is that the other leaders around that table are somewhat apprehensive at the prospect of him getting involved in the Ukraine war again, because he wasn't regarded as a very useful participant in earlier talks because of his quite apparent sympathy for President Putin and the position that President Putin has been pushing ever since this war began. So we simply don't know what this is going to mean. He's still got the small matter of the war with Iran to finish sorting out.
Oh, that's all fixed.
Oh, yeah, that's all fixed. Sorry, I forgot. Yeah. So it's a big question mark.
I mean, it is noticeable, Katya, that in the last few months, while President Trump's attention has been consumed by other things, and I don't know whether it's a coincidence or not, Ukraine has started doing noticeably better. I mean, is it arguable at this point, as the rest of the G7, that is, the rest of Europe, really start to understand that President Trump is possibly more of a hindrance than a help, that it's possibly everyone's probably better off if he's not involved?
Well, I think the big worry is what happens when he's actively disaffected or, not just not involved, but actually a hindrance, or when he feels that he wants to be even further towards the Russian side, all the while that it's a vaguely neutral stance. I still feel that there's enough deterrence there for Russia to feel that they also don't know what he's going to do, and therefore there's an element of deterrence still there just by the sheer weight and size of the American military, the help with intelligence, that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't completely, rule out that still plays a role. I think it's still quite a big factor, not to annoy him too much, basically, and to keep him at least vaguely on side. Because,
Robin, it is ridiculous that this is a factor, but so many aspects of this are that there is probably going to have to be some way found for him to get a great deal of the credit for any deal that is eventually done, whether or not he actually had anything to do with it.
I think there's one certainty. If and when the fighting stops, he will claim credit, regardless of how it came about. My guess throughout this dreadful war has been that it will eventually dribble to a halt without perhaps a formal ceasefire agreement, perhaps a series of informal truce agreements. It will become, to all intents and purposes, a frozen conflict without a peace deal, without perhaps a formal ceasefire, but both sides will stop shooting at each other. For Mr. Putin, the problem will be that he will have to come to that position having not achieved his war aims, and he will somehow have to explain that to his people, even though he's not answerable to them in the same way that Western leaders are answerable to their electorates. So I don't foresee any huge change in the diplomatic comings and goings over the coming week. I'm sure we'll hear more from Mr. Trump, but as I say, how much of it reflects reality and how much of it just comes from the fantasy world in which he lives, who knows?
And Katya, there has been a tendency to assume in the last year and a half especially that there is there is this fairly clean split among Ukraine's nominal allies, i.e. the split between the United States and between Europe. But does that undersell or fail to acknowledge such divisions as there may be within Europe about their preferred outcome here? Because it's hard to imagine that all of the EU has exactly the same idea in mind vis-à-vis a preferred outcome.
I think it underestimates the tensions on both sides. I mean, in the EU, you've obviously got states, especially those further to the east, who rely on Russian fossil fuels to this day, who I think even within Germany, say, for example, you've got already people saying, when can there be peace so we can have some sort of energy relationship back with them, because that's an unresolved question where Germany is supposed to get its energy from in the future. So that on that side, there's a lot more ambiguity, I think, than people often take note of. And I think on the US side, I just spent a few days in Sweden with a conference with lots of senior American figures, and they were all trying to calm down the Europeans, saying, can you just bear in mind that there's more to America than Trump? I mean, we're all still here. And one of them said, just also bear in mind that every time we have gone to war, it's actually been without a prior formal agreement. We decided on the spur of that moment that it was necessary to get involved. And so, should push come to shove in Europe, there's a separate debate to be had irrespective of what's currently going on.
Because there are, certainly in my own conversations with Ukrainians over the last few years, Robin, suspicions and scepticism in some parts about what the real intentions of quite a lot of Europe is. There's certainly a strand of Ukrainian opinion that wonders rather bleakly if Europe isn't actually kind of okay with things as they are, i.e. Ukraine smashing up Russia's military on Europe's behalf and protecting the rest of Europe like that. There's also concerns that a frozen conflict will be used by Europe as an excuse to drag out the accession process to the EU, which Ukraine and Moldova are both supposed to have started this week for basically ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Ukrainians are right to wonder to what extent the current members of the EU really would welcome them wholeheartedly into the European Union. The same goes, I think, for the members of NATO. The one thing I do think that all of the EU powers are agreed upon is that they cannot accept Russia or any other power forcibly seizing by military means the territory of another sovereign nation. And that is their bottom line. That is what President Putin has tried to do, and that is what the Europeans are determined to try to stop him doing. Whether they will de facto accept, in the same way as they have accepted the Turkish army occupying about 1/3 of Cyprus for the last 50-something years, is an open question. But the bottom line, at least in theory, is that this cannot be allowed to happen.
I just want to close on this subject, Katja, by bringing it back to Germany, because it has been posited more than once that Germany might actually be kind of the model here, i.e. you end up with a West Ukraine and an East Ukraine. The West Ukraine is incorporated into the Western superstructures, the EU and NATO, etc. Nobody really recognises that East Ukraine is actually a thing, and everybody sort of understands, given the historical record of nobody enjoying living under Russian dominion, they'll get it back eventually.
Well, if so, that's not exactly a desirable model, is it? I mean,
But it might be the best we can get.
Well, being from East Germany myself and now living in
This is why I wondered.
In the glorious West, I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity, and I'd rather not have a repeat of that anywhere else in the world. I don't know. I mean, effectively, that amounts to a frozen conflict, doesn't it? Once you do that, and you kind of accept that there's a line there, and it may just be there for however long it takes for that conflict to be resolved. But ultimately, I think, and there's maybe the difference there with Germany, I don't think that during the Cold War, this was all quite defensive, even from the Soviet side. The idea that East Germany was sort of the bulwark against the West, I don't think they wanted to push much further than that. East Germany was already there to be traded in at various times by the Soviets. With Ukraine, that's very different. If Putin and other people see it as kind of the Russian heartland, this is where the soul of the country was born, so to speak, they will always want the rest of it. And so in terms of future prospects there for the Russian side to accept that this is a frozen conflict, I think there's a lot less likelihood of that happening than there was in Germany during the Cold War.
Well, to the world of finance now, and an upward increment in interest rates has arrived to disturb the slumbers of mortgage holders. Last week, the European Central Bank nudged its rate upwards from 2% to 2.25%, the first such hike since 2023, a response to inflation occasioned by energy price rises linked to the war in the Persian Gulf. Earlier today, the Bank of Japan raised its interest rate to the highest level in 31 years, though this is significantly less exciting than it might sound, as it means that Japan has merely raised its interest rate from a barely extant 0.75% to a vanishingly negligible 1%. Both the US Federal Reserve and the UK's Bank of England are due to consider their rates this week, though the betting seems to be on no change. If only we had a historian to hand who has specialised in a period of great economic turmoil. Katja, have you started buying gold yet? Or are you...
or foreign currency? The question is which one? No, not as such. I mean, obviously, we're not looking at... I get this question actually a lot. People say, are we sort of in 1928 on the cusp of this great economic catastrophe?
Speaking as a mortgage holder, you'll let me know. Won't you?
Of course, as people did at the time, but nobody was listening. There was a lot of economic Cassandraing going on, with nobody listening to the predictions. No, I don't think this kind of idea that we're on the brink of a catastrophe on that scale. I think that's more to do with our sense of crisis right now than with a realistic expectation of what's going to happen, not least because we do have that history as a backdrop, and people now have knowledge that they didn't have in the 1920s. And I wouldn't be spending my life as a historian if I didn't think that there are lessons from history that we're actually taking forward and doing things better with today. But it is, of course, a serious situation, and you can see just by the scale of what's happening and by the scale of the economic intervention that there are enough people in positions of knowledge and power who decide to make these interventions on a scale that are quite, I wouldn't say unprecedented, of course, but certainly out of scale when you look at the last few years. So that is a significant thing, but perhaps not quite as catastrophic as it was.
Robin, at which point I will try to invoke perspective as kind of a cure for panic. I'm going to go ahead and wager that you can just about remember when UK interest rates were around 17% in the late 1970s. They hit 15% on Black Wednesday in September 1992, which I remember. And actually, even during the 1990s, I was kind of surprised to look this up in retrospect. 6 to 7% was by no means regarded as unusual amid what was widely enjoyed as kind of a boom.
I remember when the interest rate on my mortgage went up to 15%.
Ouch.
Yeah, it really was. Ouch.
Mind you, at this time, like houses cost, what, 500 quid? Yeah.
Rather less than they do now. It is true. No, I don't think we are in anything resembling a sort of Weimar meltdown situation. I mean, just to take Japan for 1 second, I think it is a case on its own, because Japan has been in a state of economic stagnation for well over 2 decades, with interest rates not non-existent. So the fact, as you say, that it's rocketed up to a terrifying 1%, I don't think means that we're all on the brink of catastrophe. I mean, for the rest of the Western world, I think central banks know pretty well now what they have to do to keep inflation under control, and they use interest rates as a way of doing that. I'm not an economist, I have to say, so I've never quite been sure that I understand exactly why the levers that they pull have the effect that they hope they will. But I'm relatively confident that they know what they're doing, and they will be able to keep this thing within reasonable bounds.
So what do we think is driving these increases, Katja? Is it just the slightly bizarre event of the war in the Persian Gulf and Iran discovering that, hey, this is fun, we can bring the global economy to a juddering halt?
Well, as a historian, we like our short, medium and long-term sort of causes for things, and I think that's what we're seeing here. I mean, that's the latest cause of economic turmoil, I think, in a series of them. You know, you can go back to COVID. We haven't paid these debts and the expenditure off by a long way.
The Bank of England rate, and I checked this, it's amazing how much of that bizarre period we forget. At one point in 2020, the base rate was 0.1%. And I bet everybody in the country wishes their mortgages were at 0.1%.
Yeah.
Savers, on the other hand, are grateful that they're not.
Well, indeed.
As they were in the 1920s, when their debt was suddenly wiped out.
But just finally on this one, Robin, the person who will oversee this decision in the US this week is Trump's hand-picked new Federal Reserve Chair, Kevin Warsh. And obviously one of the many disagreements that the president had with his predecessor was that he would not lower interest rates. I mean, how funny would it be if Warsh reacted to recent inflationary pressures by raising them?
I've always believed you had a pretty warped sense of humour, and yeah, you're right, though. It would be pretty funny. I mean, what I read suggests that that's not what the Fed is going to do, that they think that things are still manageable with interest rates pretty much where they are. But yes, we've still got the backwash from the COVID pandemic. We do now have the oil price spike. We don't know how quickly that's going to come down because we still have no idea to what extent traffic is going to move freely through the Strait of Hormuz and how much, if at all, the Iranians are going to charge commercial ship owners. So there are lots of unknowns, but central banks don't like acting in a hurry. So I think they're going to sort of hold their breath for a little bit and wait a few months.
Well, to China now, which is precisely the itinerary undertaken by Myanmar's President Min Aung Hlaing as he becomes the latest participant in one of those photos in which Chinese President Xi Jinping shakes hands with a visitor while radiating the approximate joie de vivre of someone being introduced to their hangman. President Min Aung Hlaing doesn't get out much, being shunned by most countries since he led the coup d'etat which overthrew the elected government of Nobel Peace Peace Laureate Aung San Suu Kyi back in 2021, and then attempted to scorch the earth dwelt upon by his regime's opponents. Judges at the International Criminal Court are presently reviewing an application for a warrant for his arrest. Robin, first of all, as a long-time observer of the diplomatic circus, what is President Xi doing in these pictures? Because it's the same thing every time. He has never looked in any picture with a visiting dignitary like he wouldn't literally rather be doing anything else. Is he trying to be funny, or is this some sort of bit he's doing just to keep himself sane?
It's difficult to know, isn't it? My suspicion is that he knows that these pictures are of far more importance to his visitor than they are to him. He doesn't need to buttress his reputation by being seen to greet all manner of foreign dignitaries, but they can buttress, they hope, their reputation by being seen for a moment at least to be regarded as on a par with the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Which is, no small thing. And for the leader of a particularly brutal military dictatorship in Myanmar, it is a useful reminder to his own people, at least, that he is not entirely without friends. He has one, at least.
Katya, the Myanmarese regime, as Robin has intimated, is the kind of regime, reports of whose doings you would like to think would make even the president of China blanch. That being the case, why is China so supportive of this Myanmarese regime? Because China is very supportive, even beyond allowing him to have his picture taken.
Yeah, I mean, partially it's about power and infrastructure and all the usual things that the Chinese try to do in the region around them. The whole idea of you build ports, you build roads, you build train stations, you ensnare other nations around you and in your sphere of influence by providing these things for them, and then they're indebted to you both financially and politically. I think we see that with other regimes in the region too, not least if you take North Korea, which is arguably even more of a dodgy partner than Myanmar. And the other thing that links into your earlier question about his demeanour as well is that this goes back to, I think, a style of politics as well that in the West we've now largely forgotten, but it's very Cold War-y, this idea, if you look at his language as well, when he's talking about the brother states, this comes straight out of the communist sort of playbook and out of their rhetoric. So in a way, I think both the way that this is being portrayed to the world as well as what they're actually doing it's about power in the region, not about moral politics.
Robin, I'm glad Katya mentioned the language, because I was struck by a couple of quotes which, according to the Chinese readout, were uttered by the president himself, one of which is, and I quote, "China supports Myanmar's new government in coordinating development and security imperatives to find a correct path of development that suits its national conditions and wins popular support." It may just be where this comes from, but that does sound kind of like a threat of some sort.
Maybe it sounds better in Mandarin Chinese. I don't know. We need George Orwell, I think, to translate it, to rewrite it. I would be much more interested, frankly, in what President Xi had to say if he asked his visitor a very simple question: is Aung San Suu Kyi still alive, and can you prove it? Because one of the most worrying things about this really very nasty regime is that they haven't allowed anybody to be in touch with or hear from Aung San Suu Kyi for some years now, including her son, including her lawyers. There is actually no evidence that she is still alive. If she is still alive, she's 80 years old, as she is said to be in poor health. It would be very nice, somehow or other, for information about her whereabouts and her well-being to be known as a result of this visit, but I don't hold my breath.
Just finally on this one, Katya, does China also have the advantage here, and you could also say it's definitely Myanmar's advantage here, or at least the Myanmarese regime's advantage, that everybody else has sort of lost interest in Myanmar. During the period when Aung San Suu Kyi was more prominent, a compromised figure though she later became somewhat, she was known, she was a story, she was somebody whose every utterance got her on the news, etc. Whereas now I suspect most people in most Western capitals could not name a single citizen of the country.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that, and also just the unknown nature of the regime, what's actually going on. It's very secluded and kind of closed in itself as well. So even if you were interested in, either changing it politically or investing in it or doing something with it, you just don't know what the actual country is like on the inside. It's become a haven for all sorts of dubious activities over the years as well. Even China is annoyed with that because they see it as a sort of refuge for various illegal activities too. So I think that is indeed part of the advantage, because to China it's just so big and powerful and obviously not far away, it's in the region. That's less of a risk to take than to other sort of, say, Western actors or other people who wanted to get involved.
Well, to India now, which has enacted a very specific version of the targeted social media bans becoming increasingly commonplace, even if nobody has yet done the obviously sensible thing and banished men over 50 from all platforms. India has placed a temporary block on Telegram in order to protect the integrity of the annual entrance exam, which is sat by aspiring medical students. Last month, more than 2.2 million people took the test, but the results were annulled after it emerged that the exam papers had been leaked on Telegram. The exam will be resat on June 21st until when Telegram is theoretically off the air. Fortunately, there are absolutely no other means by which people may distribute illicit information. The new papers will be helicoptered to the appropriate locations by the Indian Air Force. Katya, as this table's designated representative of the online generations, is banning Telegram for a couple of weeks going to work? I'm going to go ahead and guess that the answer is probably not.
Well, it's not really. I mean, even the intention here isn't necessarily to ban Telegram, as it is to deal with this specific issue. So I don't know how long they'll even stick with this. And
until June 22nd, apparently,
yeah,
when the exam has been taken.
Indeed. So and it also doesn't really deal with the underlying issue here. Is that, I mean, it's the idea of there being a fairly decentralized way now of disseminating information. It's getting harder and harder for both for good and bad purposes to try and clamp down on individual arms on it. So for British academia, for example, I can say that a lot of them have gone back to doing in-person exams by hand with an actual pen on actual paper with the students, because they just have no other way of guaranteeing that there isn't foul play there. And that obviously is not a principle that you can apply across the board to absolutely everything. So I just see this as another, slightly desperate attempt to try and stem the tide of something that may be very difficult to stem. Because
it is difficult, because there has been a lot of angst, Rob, and understandably, and I think this is the kind of thing Katya is getting at, of students simply using AI to generate their essays. This isn't that. This is trying to keep the actual exam questions under wraps. And obviously, if one person gets them and puts them online, and it's probably very difficult to construct a system under which no one person can get them, then they're out there.
Yeah, it raises the whole question about whether the traditional way of setting exams has much of a future, because, as you say, there's the whole AI issue, which hasn't been resolved, and then there's this age-old issue of corrupt actors selling access to exam questions before the exam is actually set. So there is a very real problem. I'm not sure that banning the platform on which questions are leaked is necessarily the answer. I just would have thought, a little more security around the papers themselves would probably be simpler, cheaper and more proportionate.
I mean, I'm quite excited, Katya, by the idea of them being helicoptered in by the Air Force. I mean, I'm just thinking back to my own high school certificate exams in Sydney. If we'd had helicopters landing on the roof of Mossman High School to drop the papers off, I think that would have added greatly to the sense of occasion.
Yeah, but maybe not to your concentration or to the way of actually focusing on what you're supposed to do. That would have created a lot of excitement. But I agree with Robin. I mean, that's also in a way an age-old problem. I mean, papers were always leaked. I think the difference, or, gotten hold of one way or another. I think the bigger problem is that this now happens on such a big scale. So if you're trying to centralize exams, and somebody gets hold of them, rather than it being spread to one class or to one school or to one area, suddenly you've got an entire country with that problem. So maybe there's a way of decentralizing the process again as a way around that, but just simply banning the platform also doesn't seem to strike me as a good solution.
Okay, well, I want to finish by soliciting confessions about whether either of you have ever, in any similar sense, taken a shortcut, cheated on an exam, looked up the answers in advance, anything like that. Because I can sit here, Robert, and say I did not cheat on any of my exams, and by golly, I got the marks to prove it.
Good for you. The last time I sat an exam, I think, was at the end of my undergraduate studies a very long time ago when exam papers were still delivered by carrier pigeon. So there was no opportunity to cheat. It would never have occurred to me to try to solicit the questions to a paper from some corrupt member of the faculty, if there were such a thing. I'm sure there wasn't in those days. But no, I don't think I have ever cheated. And like you, I have the exam marks to prove it.
Katja, anything you want to share?
Well, the German exam system, both at A-level and at university, is so ridiculous. Like, you get a question and you sit there for 4 hours writing an essay on it. It would be very difficult to cheat on it. Ultimately, you still have to write the bloody thing. So even if you knew the question beforehand, you still have to sit there and write it out and think about the question and, recall the evidence that you need. So in a way, I think, whilst I hated it at the time, I do think in hindsight, this is quite a good way of doing it, because whilst it was torture, it did actually make you think.
Katja Hoyer and Robin Lustig, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, we head to the Chinese city named after the fictional 1933 literary paradise of Shangri-La to sort fact from fiction. This episode of our Tall Stories strand comes from Monocle Radio's Tom Webb.
On an ancient tea trading route connecting China and Tibet, you may discover Shangri-La. Formerly called Zhongdian almost 25 years ago, the Chinese government changed its name to the fictitious Tibetan town from James Hilton's 1933 utopian novel Lost Horizon. Though this was a move largely to promote tourism in the region, with its dramatic landscapes, monasteries and culture, many would certainly label it a paradise. Indeed, to this day, its monastery is its biggest draw, an important pilgrimage site and home to more than 700 monks. Sungsanlin Monastery, often called Little Potala Palace, it is the largest Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Yunnan, first built in 1679. At the foot of its 150 stairs from the main entrance area up to the main assembly hall, I met Shangri-La local and hotel group Songsam's tour guide Kieran. At an altitude of 3,400 meters, we took things slowly.
This monastery, it is a center of the Tibetan Buddhism, and it is the biggest monastery in the Yunnan province. There is someone who called this monastery as a small Potala Palace in Tibet. So it looks like Potala. This monastery, it's been like 300 years, and he faced the cultural revolutions and the issues during have been in these areas. So it also united the minorities around this monastery. The monks, the gurus, they got the really high power to deal with the problems. They used to set their government in the monastery. And in the history, they help lots of people, the poor people, the rich people, and they look the people equally and to help them.
Inside, 108 columns support gilded ceilings, magnificent frescoes depict Buddhist legends, and exquisite golden Buddha sculptures line the halls. The air is filled with the scent of incense and the sound of prayer, adding to its already mythical setting. For pilgrims wanting a taste of luxury in the mountains, there is only one place to stay. With no televisions, limited Wi-Fi and ultra-remote locations, Songsam hotels are sanctuaries offering luxury through giving guests less but time to switch off. In Shangri-La stands the very first Songsam property in a traditional Tibetan farming village. The building uses traditional Tibetan construction methods, including thick stone and earth walls and intricate mortise and tenon wood joinery without nails. Interiors feature authentic tanka paintings, handcrafted carpets, antique Tibetan furniture, and copperwork, all sourced locally. It's where I caught up with Solomon Mahan, Group Vice President of Songsam.
Our group, we started 24 years ago, so we developed everything for 24 years. So we adapt all the international standard including the architecture and the interior design and what we use, what we eat, but how we keep the way we are, because we use local people. 95% of our staff are local. We have 1,600 staffs together, and 95% of them are local. So if you have all the local people surrounding work for you, then you kept everything the same. We have 18 different lodges along the Himalayas. So people come from all over the world, come to join the Himalaya, to see the snow mountains, to go into the monastery with the monks, to experience the culture. It's preserved for years, maybe for decades, for 100 years. So that's the reason it's kept the same way when people doing the whole day. For example, now is the winter time. Winter time to me is the perfect timing to go to Tibet or the Tibetan region. Now, because everybody, the nomad people come down from the mountains because of the weather, and the agriculture is stopped, everything, because it's covered by snow. So people have nothing to do but weddings and festivals. Now China opened the visa-free issue for I think whole Europe. And after pandemic and people starting to travel, so this is a good thing for us. And we want more international travelers to come to Tibet to see. And now you have better standards of the lodging, and the food quality is good. And we have Tibetan people who speak English speaking guide to welcome you guys.
More than just a place to stay, the mountain hotels act as basis for immersion in the Tibetan cultural regions of Western China, with some guests staying over a month at a time to paint, walk and participate in guided wellness experiences. Whatever you consider to be your Shangri-La, you can almost certainly discover a version of it here.
Thank you, Tom. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Katja Hoyer and Robin Lustig. Today's show was produced by Thomas Waterhouse and researched by Josefina Astrid Nagler-Gomez. Our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.